Alright, I think we can finally get this going. Have had some technical difficulties because recording on my phone, not working. Recording on this has not been working until I just found this microphone. So we are going to talk into this and hopefully these help. First, we're going to start with chapters 1 and 2 of Great Expectations because those are our foundation chapters. If we don't get them, we don't get the whole book. Okay, we are going to make our way back to chapters 1 and 2, the entire novel. So we need to get chapters 1 and 2. We read these together, but we read them together in December, so it's been a long time. So I'm just going to point out some key facts, key points, and we'll keep it moving through. So this video is for chapters 1 and 2 of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. So first, let's open up. We meet our narrator, Philip Pirrip, otherwise known to us as Pip. We are in England. It is Christmas of 1812, or Christmas Eve at this point. And we open up in a graveyard. Okay? Opening the novel in a graveyard is going to tell us what? It's going to tell us that this story is not, for the most part, going to be lighthearted. It's going to set the tone and the mood immediately. It's going to show us the depths of the darkness that Pip can go through. Pip is in a graveyard visiting with his parents. Pip has no parents. He is being raised by his sister, who we'll get into the next chapter. But Pip ultimately, the term that Charles Dickens used is an orphan. Okay? Just using that term alone is going to show the depth and darkness of who Pip is and the struggles that he's going to have to come from. Ultimately, this beginning scene just pretty much is Pip's way of showing us this is kind of where it all began for him. This is where the story all began. There are things that happened before this, but this is that important driving, here's the start of my life point for him. So he's in the graveyard and he is confronted with what they call an ex-convict. It's a convict, a criminal that has escaped from the hulks, which we will find out later, which are the prison boats. But our criminal has escaped, and he comes up to Pip and just immediately begins threatening him. He says he needs victuals and a file. We know that victuals mean food, and a file is something that can be used to ultimately get his shackles off of him. And I feel like Pip's probably a good person, and it was kind of like fate, because who Pip lives with, Mrs. Joe, his sister, her husband is a blacksmith, so he would have a file. But he wants food and a file, and he threatens Pip with, if you don't get this, there is someone with me. However, there is someone with him, but it's not the same person he's threatening with. But he says, there is someone with me, and this person will ultimately torment and truly, truly harm you if you don't get this for me. And this scares Pip. Okay, so this is going to be the beginning of what shows us Pip's age and Pip's naive character at the time. So the fact that he can threaten Pip like this, and Pip technically can't do anything about it, shows us how young Pip is. Pip is very young at this opening scene. Also, Pip is gullible about the threats. I mean, he says he's going to tear his heart out. This is terrifying for Pip, and kind of coerces him into really helping him. So showing us more just Pip is naive, gullible, and the convict chose Pip for a reason, probably because of all these things. Now, let's look at page 5 together, and we're going to see a quote that I think shows even more of what convinced Pip to do this for the convict. On page 5, Pip says, "He looked in my young eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people, stretching up cautiously out of their graves to get a twist upon his ankle and pull him in." What's the significance of this? It's going to show us that our convict was ultimately looked like he was on the verge of death. He looked frail. He looked, almost like a corpse. So why would this coerce Pip to help him? Because he feels bad for him. Okay, not only is he terrified, but he feels bad for him, and this moron goes to show us Pip's character and himself. So, at the end of chapter 1, our convict is going to go off, and Pip is going to go off, and he tells us he was frightened, but he's going to find a way to get the food and the file to him the next day, which is Christmas. All right, let's look at chapter 2, which is page 6. So chapter 2, we get to truly meet Mrs. Joe and Joe Gargery. Mrs. Joe is Pip's sister who is raising him, and Joe is Pip's sister's husband. Now, when we look at this beginning, Pip describes them in 2 completely different ways. So Mrs. Joe is described with nothing but crude comments. I mean, he calls her ugly on the outside and the inside. He talks about her quite rough. Like, every description of Mrs. Joe is a harsh, ultimate criticism. Now, there's a big contrast when it comes to describing Joe. He describes Joe as saintly. He describes Joe as ultimately his best friend, and that's because he really is, and this shows us the difference in how he sees these 2 individuals. I mean, if you're talking about someone that you truly care about, you're not going to describe them in a bad way. However, if you're talking about someone that you don't like at all, you're going to describe them pretty harsh. You're not going to say good about them. You might throw in one comment here, but Pip don't even do that. So that's how we open up chapter 2. We also open up and see maybe why Pip describes Mrs. Joe this way, because our first sentence tells us that she had brought me up by hand. Now, what does that mean? Being brought up by hand ultimately is going to mean you're being raised by someone who is not supposed to be raising you. And it's going to kind of show that bitter resentment that Mrs. Joe feels for having to raise him, because she's like, this is not my kid. I did not sign up for this. However, I have to do this because our parents died. So continuing to be told that, it's probably going to affect you in the long run. But then, however, Pip goes on to say, I don't know if she says it because that, or because she's constantly beating me. And not only does she beat me, but she also beats Joe, her husband. So we have 2 meanings to that, and both meanings are just kind of not going to have us in a safe space in our home. Now, this scene opens up with Mrs. Joe has supposedly been out looking for Pip, and she's been looking for him with Tickler, who is like the cane that she uses to beat them. When she comes home, she finds them. Joe has already warned him, and then Joe throws him behind him and kind of covers him so that Mrs. Joe can't get to him. This shows right off the bat the camaraderie that Joe and Pip have and the relationship that they have. Joe is Pip's saving grace, truly, and Joe has taken on this role, and he really relishes in it as well. Now, getting the food for the, Pip's not too worried about getting the file, but he is worried about getting the food for the convict. Now, if you're like me, if I took something out of my pantry, if I took something out of my fridge, unless it's like my son's milk, no one's going to notice. He would notice that. But other than that, no one's going to notice. Even if I went to my parents' house and took something out of their fridge or their pantry, even if they notice, they'll just be like, oh, whatever, I'll go to the store and get another. That may be true for us, but it is not true for the lower class of England in the early 1800s. If food is missing, it's going to be noted, especially the day before Christmas, because what do you do on Christmas? You eat, you cook, you celebrate. The day before Christmas is going to be very noticeable what is missing. However, Pip has devised a plan and is going to do it. First, he takes the bread that he's supposed to eat that night and he puts it down his pant leg and thinks they're not going to notice. Well, they notice. However, Joe just thinks he's ate it really quick and is ultimately worried about his health due to eating it that quick. The medicinal treatment for this at the time was to drink tar water. Is that a great treatment? No, but that's what they have Pip do. He does it because he's like, well, here's one thing of food. And he goes on about his day. Later that evening, he goes into their kitchen. He steals some bread, some cheese, mincemeat, a little bit of brandy, which he replaces with tar water, which we'll get into later. And the big thing, the real, true, noticeable thing, is the pork pie. He steals all of that to take to the convict. He also gets the file, and he goes on about his day. Now, I think the real important part of this chapter comes from the word choice that Charles Dickens used. So when we look at the end of this chapter, the end of this chapter, page 14, he says that Pip must rob the pantry. I think that word rob is just a strong word to use for this. I mean, if I'm going to take food, if I'm going to take some bread out of my pantry, I'm not going to say I'm robbing it. Now, if I were going to someone's house that I had no idea who they were, yeah, I might say I'm robbing the pantry. But why would Pip use this term, he's going to rob the pantry? It's ultimately going to show us his true inner feelings and how wanted and how cared for and how comforted he feels at home. He's saying he's going to rob the pantry because he ultimately doesn't feel that this home is his. Why? Well, we see that at the beginning of the chapter because Mrs. Joe is going to constantly say, "Oh no, lights, lights, I'm here." Oh goodness. We have lights. But ultimately, Mrs. Joe is going to say she brought him up by hand. Moreover, meaning that he doesn't belong here. So Pip feels like taking this from his pantry is a criminal act. And honestly, if I were talked to that way and treated that way by my sister in her home, I would feel the same. So the word choice goes and shows us exactly where Pip is in life. And this just builds and builds and builds throughout this novel to where Pip wants to be. And this isn't it. Ultimately, though, he gets the stuff and he heads out. Alright, that is chapters 1 and 2. Foundational chapters. Please make sure you get these. If you didn't read them, if you were absent, go back, reread. Because there's so many things in these that we'll just keep circling and keep circling and keep circling back to throughout all the 500 pages that we've got. Alright.